Well, welcome. We start. Welcome and thanks to our guests for being with us and share this very important intellectual moment. For us and for me, it's really a double honor, a pleasure. It's a double honor, a pleasure, because I have, in fact, I'm not your introducer. In fact, it will be Vicente Guayar. We have with us Mr. Benjamin Barber, and thank you very much to be with us. And also we have the pleasure to have with us Mr. Vicente Guayar, who is the head of the Department of Habitat Urbà in the Ayuntament of Barcelona. And he will introduce you. And Vicente was also one of the founders of this institute. He was the first director, the dean. He was a lot of things. He was all. And I think it's fantastic to have this double situation, and thank you also with Mr. Barber, who is the center, in fact, of the event today. And evidently, when we found the institute 10 years ago, we were absolutely convinced it was a change of paradigms in our organizations, in our cities, in our habitats, and in our political and civic structures. Link with this new, I don't know, informational culture, culture of information, culture of intelligent knowledge, culture of network knowledge. We think without about an advanced situation, advanced architecture, but advanced also thinking in our collective and social structures. And for you, for this to think, to share, to exchange about all these things, your figure is absolutely important. You are a big referent, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barber. And I introduce Mr. Vicente Guayar, who will be your institutional and introducer. Thank you.
Thank you, Manel. So for me it's a pleasure to introduce Benjamin Barber. Today is a little bit a strange lecture in the history of lectures at IaaC, because normally we talk about design, we talk about the fabrication, we talk about biomimesis, we talk about ecological whatever, but we never had anyone talking about serious politics as you are doing. So that means that we are, I think, upgrading the level of discussion at IaaC, arriving to the, let's say, political and social discussion. I would like to say that I first read about the book If Mayor Ruled the World through a TED Talk that Ben made, and we saw his book, and he was talking about Mayor Tria, so we were interested about this. I went to visit to his house with his wife that is here, so it was a wonderful morning, and he gave me a book as a present. I took to the plane, so when we start to take off, I start to read the book. And in the second page, in his book, he say the future, the cities or whatever, and he say, and look the sample of IaaC in Barcelona, that they are thinking about self-sufficient cities, about self-sufficient buildings. And I thought, I can't believe it. So I didn't know him, and he was talking about a place like this as a place that is true. We were discussing about how this place was created in collaboration with our today's Deputy Mayor, Tony Vives, in order to think about the future of cities, but the future is now. So we are trying now to develop the idea that has been created in the last years. And our idea that it was an approach related with how we deal with cities, how cities are created, the fact that urbanism is not, the traditional growing urbanism is not possible anymore, because the cities are mostly already built, at least here in Europe and in America. The question is how to create a theory about cities. So Barcelona was the place where the word urbanism was invented. Cerdà, that was an engineer, was a social dreamer, as some of us we are, was thinking how to use the knowledge that he had in order to create a tool, cities, in order to create a better life for people. And that's why we developed some theories. So what we like, and that's why Benjamin has invited, is that he's giving a political meaning to this vision. And this is absolutely crucial because to do something is not only to run the reality, but is to invent it. So from that point of view, I had the pleasure today to go to talk today with Ben and with the mayor of Barcelona in order to see how his ideas can be developed. And so thank you, Ben, to be here. And if we must do a revolution, let's do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicente. Coming here, I feel a little shy because it's like going to one of the world's great zoos to explain to them about the bear and the gorilla and the crocodile. I know you know these things much better than I do because partly in writing my book and thinking about cities, it is in response to the work that you are doing in this institute that Vicente has done. It is in response 10 years ago to the work of Castells, Manuel Castells, who I know well, and whose book I reviewed 10 years ago at length, and who was one of the early thinkers about the network of cities and the way cities can work together. I have also, over the years, been very interested in architecture and in design. 8 years ago, I was a guest at the Yale School of Architecture and was one of the judges of projects for new urban design. So to be here with you, who are working on the frontiers of urban architecture, is extraordinarily exciting for me. And I suspect I'm more excited to be here even than you might be that I am here. So thank you so much for this invitation, and thanks for spending a little time listening. You have to first make an adjustment, because in back you only have a picture of a book. I know you are used to thinking visually. And as architects and as designers, and I walked around this remarkable lab and saw some of the projects that you're doing, that you think visually, that you think about the city in terms of design, in terms of the shaping of space, sometimes filling a space, sometimes emptying a space. We saw a space just now by Vicente's office that is being emptied. And in emptying the space, one is creating a city. But I work in a different way. I also work on the city. I work on the human habitat, but I use a different tool. It's the tool of words. And words are another way to sculpt the city, to design governance, and to think about democracy. And I'm going to ask you, rather than to look at designs, to share what is inside the laboratory here that I will express in words, because words are the precious commodity of cities, of communities, of our civilization, and above all, of our democracy. And I want to talk particularly today about democracy in the city and the relationship between them, because democracy is in crisis in Europe and around the world today, and I want to suggest that the city and those who think about it, design it, live in it, and govern it have a very special role to play. But just to remind you, democracy is first of all the governance of words. For a long time in human civilization, we settled our conflicts and disagreements with fists, with brute strength, with guns, and as we see today in Ukraine and Afghanistan, much of the world still does politics through brute force. And the idea that we might settle our differences and find ways to live together through words, common discourse, is an extraordinary invention, and at the root of civilization, and at the root of the city. And I would remind you that in French and in English, city and citizen, cité and citoyen, have the same etymology. The very idea of citizenship is born in the city, as the idea of democracy is born inside of the city. So my topic this evening is to think in words about how we shape cities and the governance of cities to address what has become a crisis of democratic governance in the 21st century. And in a sense, you are doing from the bottom up. you are designing buildings that breathe, sustainable buildings, self-reliant buildings, resilient buildings, buildings that contribute to a sustainable landscape. And I am trying to think as a philosopher and thinker from the top down about how we can shape our institutions and our governance structures in ways that they too contribute to a resilient and a sustainable city in a world in desperate need of that. Short history lesson, which you know well, but just to remind you, the city is, of course, our oldest political institution, and in the ancient and early modern world was a primary political institution in Athens and Thebes and Alexandria in the ancient world, cities of the Mediterranean. In the early modern world, the cities of the Hansa along the North Sea, the principalities, the great free city of Amsterdam, ports like Barcelona and Marseille were the cradle of early modern democracy. But in the 15th and 16th century, the scale of our world, the expanding territories, the invention of not local neighborhoods but national peoples, ein Volk, a gens, un peuple, created a much more expansive notion of human communities that meant the city was no longer a sufficient political unit to govern these new larger jurisdictions. And during that era, with the help of political theorists like Locke and Hobbes and Baudin, and through the help of early Republicans, the idea of the nation state was born. État national, a encompassing political institution that permitted peoples in larger areas than just cities to govern themselves through popular sovereignty, representative government, and to govern themselves in terms of the much larger jurisdictions that these new national territories embodied. And for the last 400 years, the primary political unit has been the nation state. And by the way, an interesting small thing, I know of nowhere in the world ever in the last 400 years there has been a laboratory to think about the architecture of the nation state. We have to come back to the city when we think about the architecture, the design of a space, because the État nation was an abstraction, a sovereign, independent, governing entity representing supreme power and jurisdiction over a territory and a people. And that concept alone defined the nation state and its jurisdiction, and cities were swallowed up as lower subsidiary levels of governance. Below regions, below provinces, the city became, if you like, the lowest and in some ways least important element of governance. And for the last 400 years, these sovereign states have done a pretty good job in many ways of governing our lives, dealing with health, with trade, with education, with transportation, with all of the elements of daily life inside of the borders of nation states. But by the middle of the last century, we were entering a third era, not the era of cities, not the era of nation states, but an era of global challenges and global problems, an era in which the challenges we face are neither at the level of the city nor the level of the nation, but at the level of the globe. If you think of every challenge we face today, environmental change, climate change, global warming, sea rise, there's no Barcelona warming. There's no Catalonian warming. There's no Spanish or European warming. The problem is global warming. Terrorism is a global phenomenon. Terrorist organizations are malevolent and malicious non-governmental organizations with no loyalty to any particular state, which means the new warfare is a different kind of warfare, not state against state, but states trying to deal with stateless NGOs that operate across borders. And these new wars are very different, and the old armies and air forces and navies are inadequate to them. The United States of America has the most powerful army and navy and air force on earth, and it was of no use at all on September 11th. when 19 terrorists stole some airplanes, turned them into weapons, and destroyed the heart of New York and Washington. For $30 million, you can get a B-1 bomber, but it can do nothing about a suicide bomber, a single person. The asymmetry of modern war is part of the asymmetry of the nation state and the global nature of the modern world we live in. Same thing with the health pandemics. When I was a child in New York, my mother would say, don't go to New Jersey, you'll get a virus. There's a virus in New Jersey. Today, I don't worry about New Jersey viruses. I still live in New York. I worry about the West Nile virus and Mexican pig flu and Hong Kong virus and HIV and the new diseases emerging from the hot zones of Africa. Our diseases are global, and national health systems by themselves cannot deal with them. Trade, markets, capital, labor, same thing. They are global in character. They are problems without borders. The logic of the global economy means that immigrants move around looking for jobs wherever the jobs are and regardless of the political borders. And that means in most countries of the world, something like half of the mobile labor force is made up of undocumented workers, illegal immigrants. States look the other way. In my country, there are 12 million illegal immigrants. If you ask the federal government, they'll say two things. They'll say they're not here because they don't exist. Or they'll say maybe they're here but we know nothing about them, and if we find them we'll deport them, but we don't want to find them. But they exist in cities, and every mayor in Hamburg and Chicago and New York and Barcelona knows that a part of their population is made up of undocumented workers who don't exist, but their children go to school, they drive cars, they commit crimes, they need the health system and go to the hospitals, and the mayor has no choice but to recognize them and say they are here. So here is the dilemma. We live in a world of cross-border, global, interdependent problems, and we respond to them with an 18th century set of institutions, the independent, sovereign, territorial national state. And the result is, with most of the problems we face, things get worse and worse because nation states simply can't do it. Not because they are defective, not because they are corrupt, but because bordered sovereign states are simply not able to deal with borderless, global, interdependent problems. So now we ask, how do we save democracy under these circumstances? How do we deal with the global challenges of sustainability? You think about sustainable solutions in the design. And you think about how can you make a building that's resilient, that's sustainable. But in a world with global climate change, in a world with pandemic diseases, in a world with the movement of peoples and capital all over the world in an uncontrolled way, you can't only do this by design. You can't only do this by architecture. The response to these issues has to be governance, and our governing institutions simply do not respond to these problems. And that is the dilemma I thought about. I am not an urbanist. I'm not an urban sociologist. I don't have the expertise and wisdom of Manuel Castells or Richard Sennett or Saskia Saskin, who have spent their lives working. I'm a democratic theorist. I'm a philosopher and practitioner of democracy. But my question from the outside is, where can we find institutions capable of self-government and solving modern problems, not just one at a time, but together? And it's there that I said to myself, it is time to change the subject. From nation states back to cities. From prime ministers and presidents to city councilors and mayors. From the citizens of the modern État-nation who are spectators, who vote once a year, who are cynics and skeptics. And only half of those who do vote, only half of the population actually votes that can vote because they think it doesn't make any difference. That's the new citoyenneté, spectatorship. My students, when I ask them, are you interested in politics? They say, yes, I watch television. Because spectatorship is what we mean by politics. It's time to stop talking about that citizen and talk again about the citoyen engagé of the neighborhoods, of the towns, of the cities, where people still believe in and trust government, where people still think things can be made to work. So in my project, I started thinking about cities. I think it's a little bit what an architect does when he has a new design idea. You know, we're working with the wrong materials. We work with materials hostile to nature. Let's find materials friendly to nature that will adapt to and respond to the nature we want to adapt to. What forms of governance can respond to the need for participation, for engagement, for problem solving at the local level? And the answer has been there for a long time. It's in the city, it's in the township, it's in the neighborhood. And it's also in the metro region, because nowadays cities, in fact, as they are defined by the old walls of the city. Look at Barcelona. Vicente has a wonderful large map, and I saw one here too of the whole city. If you print on that the historic Roman walls or the walls of the 18th century of the city, it does not correspond to the metro region of Barcelona. The mayor said to me this morning, there are perhaps 1.5 million, 1.7 million people inside of Barcelona proper, but there's another 1.5 million, 3 million in the larger region. And of course in Catalonia beyond, what is it, 7 million? 7 million people. What is Barcelona? The old Roman city, the French city of the 18th century after the fall? Or is it the greater metro region? Barcelona is the group of people and the territory served by the cultural and transportation and health and governance facilities. And this is true around the world, but in most of the world, most of the people who benefit from cities are free riders. They take advantage of everything, the culture, the museums, the transportation, the jobs, but they pay no taxes. They live far away, they don't deal with the problems. We need modern cities that extend to the regions that are served by them. When I talk about the power of cities today, maybe people say to me, well, you're from America, what about Detroit? You think cities are so great? What about Detroit? Quick story. Detroit, the old city founded in the late 18th century, that Detroit is bankrupt. That Detroit, which in 1950 had 2 million people, the fourth largest city in the United States, today has 700,000 people, 2/3 population gone, half the schools closed, half the housing empty, much of the industry and all of the car industry vanished. That bankrupt is Detroit. But look at the 10 counties around Detroit that make up the greater Detroit metro region. Those counties have gone from 3 million to 5 million. Those counties have attracted most of the car industry. The car industry, when it left Detroit, some went to Mexico, some went to Germany, a few to Spain, but most of them went to the 10 counties around Detroit, where they still are. Most of General Motors is still right there in those 10 counties around Detroit. And it turns out that those 10 counties are the fourth most important new tech information economy regions in the United States, and among the most prosperous. Now, if you define Detroit by the old, now bankrupt inner city, yes, big problem. If you define Detroit as the metro region and allow all 10 counties to participate in recreating the larger Detroit, there's no problem in Detroit. Detroit can solve its own problems without the federal government, without aid, without charity. The problem is how we define the city. So when we talk about a world in which cities are again important, we have to understand that cities need to be redefined. We need to redefine them in terms of the real scale of their work. 2 months ago, I was in Florence, 3 months ago now. Matteo Renzi from Florence, the mayor, invited me. Matteo Renzi came, we talked together, he had read my book, we spoke a good deal. And he talked about the way in which Italy needed to be governed not by the old provinces that were represented in the Senate and in the national government, but by cities. But he said, you know, it can't just be Florence and Bologna and Torino. It has to be the metro regions around them, because that's what these cities are. The morning I gave my lecture, and he sat and listened, and he gave his lecture, and I listened. At the end, he got up and said, "I'm sorry, Professor Barber, I must leave you." I said, "Why?" He said, "I have to go to Rome." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, they've invited me to form a government." He went to Rome. He formed a government. As you well know, he's the prime minister, but he has now introduced a constitutional change that, if it is passed, will eliminate the old provinces as the primary governing functions and introduce 9 new metro regions that are the essence of Italian governance and give them much greater prominence. So thinking about Manuel Castells, thinking about Matteo Renzi, thinking about Detroit, thinking about Barcelona, it became clear to me that the way forward out of our democratic crisis, the way forward out of a world in which national governments no longer were able to solve problems, was first of all to take a step back to the city, back to the birth of civilization and democracy in the city, and then see if working with the city there wasn't a way forward. I noticed in some of the designs I looked at as I walked along out here that many of you have been thinking about small modules, new modules, different modules, and how those modules can create much larger structures. Well, in thinking about the structure of a global governance, I was thinking about a different kind of module. A module that started not with these gargantuan, ungovernable, clumsy, bureaucratic nation states that didn't know how to cooperate, but went back to a smaller module. The module of the city, the town, the neighborhood, and then the module they made up of the region, the metro region. And I asked myself, perhaps when those modules were put together, they would create a stronger and more efficient and more effective form of global governance. And so by looking at the city as a fresh governance module, much more efficient, much more effective than the state, could we create a government model, a global governance model? And I think the answer is yes, but let me tell you why, because it's not just that the old module is old, it's because of the nature of the city and the nature of its governance. 3 weeks ago I was in Brussels talking to the commissioners there, and the commissioner of the regions and the cities, Mr. Hahn, was saying to the group that we were all talking together about the future of cities in Europe, he said to me, yes, he said, the city is a very interesting and important level of governance. I said, excuse me? A level of, is that what you think the city is? Just another level of governance? The city is the quintessential human community. The city is where democracy was born. The city is the community that makes us an urban species. The city is where we are born. We're educated, we grow up, we get married, we have children, we pray, we play, we work. We get old and we die. And most people around the world, if I think we went around the room and I said, tell me where you are from, you might say, I'm from Nigeria, I'm from Pakistan, I'm from Indonesia, I'm from Japan. But you would be likely to say, I'm from Tokyo, I'm from Jakarta, I'm from Kano. We tend to think of ourselves in terms of the cities that define our identity, because our identity is fashioned in the city, and that's why architecture is so important in the city. Because the buildings which house our identity, the buildings that express and manifest our identity, we want them to represent us. It's remarkable that people with a little money still hire architects to design their own house, because they want a house that manifests their personality, the history of their family. And city buildings need to manifest the city. Looking at Gaudi here and what Gaudi has done, the attempt to create a new kind of architecture around an ideal version of the artistic and the personal in Barcelona. Every city has its own distinct architecture, and one of the extraordinary things about architecture is its variety. It has all the variety of the city, and never forget, if you go to Capitol buildings in Vienna and in Beijing and in Paris and in Washington, they all look pretty much the same. Empires have one architecture. It starts with a phallus. Dominant, monumental. But cities each have their own distinctive architecture, as distinctive and different as cities are from one another, which is why it's so remarkable to go even from Barcelona to Valencia, and then go to Bilbao, and then Marseille and Lyon. And then Eileen and I were just working for a week with the mayors in the Netherlands, where we'll be meeting next fall. And we were in about 16 cities, meeting 20 or 30 mayors. But each of those cities, from Zwolle to The Hague, to Rotterdam, to Eindhoven, Tilburg, you go to each of them, even inside of Holland, and though of course they have a Dutch and a Flemish character, they are so remarkably different from one another, because cities represent our variety. And that's why looking at this group in Barcelona of architects and students from around the world, you are a very apt and appropriate representation of the world's cities, one by one, because every city can find a variety and panoply of differences just like you represent here. You're not special because you're so different from how many countries? You said 25, 35. There are 165 or 185 nationalities in every major city of Europe, in Amsterdam and Barcelona and Madrid, because cities are defined by their variety. They are distinct from one another, but they also have this extraordinary variety inside the city. So at one and the same time, in talking to the mayor this morning, it was remarkable. He talked about two things. He talked about the fundamental Catalonian identity of Barcelona, and Catalonian, how important. And at the same moment he talked about the solidarity of this community of Catalonia, he talked about the extraordinary variety of the population, the people who came from all over the earth, this great trading city that had people from all around. At one and the same time, Catalonian solidarity and global multiculturalism. And many cities are like that. Most cities are like that. New York is the same. I was born in New York. I can tell you, it's an old Dutch city. It's a New English city. It has quite a strong identity. But as you know, when you go there, it's one of the most cosmopolitan, varied environments on earth. And that's true of cities everywhere. And that's why living in them has always been something that young people care for. Young people around the world come to cities. Gay people around the world come to cities. Traders around the world come to cities. People escaping poverty come to the cities, even to the slums of cities, because they have more opportunity for change and growth and mobility in the worst slums and ghettos of the world than they do in the rural hinterlands they come from. And that's not a defense of slums. It's to say even the worst slums offer more possibility in the city to the poor than the places they come from. So cities have these extraordinary possibilities, and the result of that variety, that distinctiveness, is that the mayors of cities turn out to be, and I've studied them comparatively in many different nations, they are a different kind of politician. National politics in Spain and the United States and Italy and any country you choose are about ideology, the great ideological principles. Prime ministers and presidents stand on principle, which means they don't sit down to talk to other people that disagree with them. Like Martin Luther, they say, "Hier stehe ich und kann nicht anders." Here I stand and cannot do otherwise. That's a beautiful thing for a religious prophet. It is a disaster for a politician who says that, because it means I will not negotiate, I will not compromise, I will not work. If I'm a socialist, I will not speak to big business. If I'm a businessman and a conservative, I won't talk to the unions. Well, that might work in Madrid, it won't work in Barcelona. It might work in London, it won't work in Bristol. It might work in Washington, it won't work in Louisville and Portland and San Diego. Because when you're a mayor, you have to get things done and solve things. So mayors cannot afford to be ideologues. They are problem solvers. They are pragmatists. They do things. They get things done. I think one reason Vicente has spent so long working in and with cities is that men of action, women who want to get things done, they know the city is where that happens. Not the grand capital, but the city, because mayors have to solve problems. They can't afford to stand on principle. Last year, the government of the United States of America closed down twice. Part of the thing was nobody noticed. But the other and more important thing was you could do that and get along for a while. But imagine closing Valencia for one day. No police, no firemen, no sanitation, no schools, no hospitals, no public services. You can't do it. Cities have not closed all the way back to the beginning of time ever. Not under siege, not in times of plague. When in 1714, we're celebrating this year, the French were at the outside of Barcelona. Barcelona didn't close and say, oh, we're under siege, the French are coming. It couldn't. It had to continue to be a working city right up till the moment when the French came in, and then they were repelled, and then the peace was made, and then afterwards it had to go on being a city, whether it was under the French or the Spanish or Madrid or under self-rule. Because cities are where we live our lives, and cities provide the services that are needed for us to live. So they are tremendously important to us, and they simply cannot be closed down. And the mayors who run them know it, and they know they have to find out. And you can be a good socialist mayor or a conservative mayor or a market mayor or a liberal or Christian democratic mayor. But either way, the garbage has to be picked up. The metro has to run. You have to educate the children. There has to be a place to go when you're sick. Those services must be provided, and you can argue about how to provide them, private or public, but you cannot say, while we are figuring it out, while I'm disagreeing with somebody else, we will simply not provide the services. Can't do it. And mayors don't do it, which means mayors understand the essence of democratic governance, which is not to give sermons and have great prophecies about what is true in the world, but about creating a framework within which we can live our lives. Democratic governance is about framing our lives so that we can do the things that we care about. And mayors get it, city councilors get it, and the citizens of cities get it. And that's why for me then, when I think about where do we look, where do we go to find institutions, political personalities and leaders who will be capable of solving the great and grievous global problems we face, whether it's climate change or illegal immigration or the movement of markets and commodities and capital around the world in ways that's very destructive to human social services. I look not to presidents, not to the United Nations, not to the World Bank, not to the IMF. I look to mayors, I look to city councilors, and I look to their citizens. But then we ask, wait a minute, if you do that, you're going back before the nation state. And you said the city was at a scale where it couldn't deal even with national problems. And now you want the city to deal with global problems? How do you do that? And the answer is together. Together. What cities have always done well, work interdependently and across borders together. The cities of the ancient Mediterranean figured out very quickly there could not be Athenian trade and Theban trade and Alexandrian trade and Carthaginian trade unless all the cities were trading partners. Trade only works when cities work together. The cities of the Hansa in the 10th and 11th century along the North Sea understood that if Hamburg prospered, that didn't mean St. Petersburg got worse and Amsterdam got worse. It meant they all grew together. They prospered together. Cities can grow and prosper together while nations grow at each other's expense. When Germany gets larger, Poland gets smaller. But Warsaw and Berlin can both flourish. At the same time, they can both have excellent opera houses. They can both be great trading partners with one another. They can both have vibrant political institutions. So cities are naturally interdependent and interactive and can work together and can create together and know how to solve problems together. And when I say we need global governance institutions, part of the issue is we already have them. To take an example, my wife is deeply engaged in climate change and dealing with the great scourge of rapid climate change through the carbon industry and the pumping of carbon and carbon emissions into the atmosphere. The most urgent problem we face today, the COP process, the UN process that led to Kyoto, is a couple of decades old, and over 5 years ago, 184 nations were in Copenhagen. And they spent 2 weeks in Copenhagen, and at the end they explained why their sovereignty did not permit them to do anything. Because nobody can monitor the United States. We're number one. We're sovereign. Don't tell us what to do. And the gas industry said, you need us, and you need energy independence. And today, the fracking industry is saying to Europeans, you want to be free of Putin and Russian oil, then frack. That's the solution. It's always so easy to do that. And nation states have done nothing about it. And in the 5 years since Copenhagen, nothing. Next year they'll do Paris. But nothing has happened. But mayors got tired of waiting. And already 15, 20 years ago, they started an organization called ICLE, the environmental issues. And then because that was not as effective as some mayors wanted, Michael Bloomberg, a couple of years ago, started a C40 climate cities, which is now 65 fairly large cities that cooperate together around lowering carbon emissions inside the city. And you know what? 80% of carbon emissions come from cities, which means that cities are in a position to actually have a profound impact on carbon emissions. And I know in your design and architecture, you're thinking at a micro level, how do we deal with building materials and with ways of living that reduce carbon and reduce waste? But the city mayors are thinking at the macro level is how do we limit the carbon emissions going in the atmosphere by limiting petroleum and coal and natural gas and creating alternative energies that are self-sufficient and resilient. And while states have done nothing, cities are making genuine progress. I won't do it here, but in my book I talk about how Los Angeles, through upgrading and greening its port, has reduced carbon emissions by 20% in Los Angeles. How in New York, by upgrading insulation standards in the old buildings, we have cut 8 to 9% of emissions. How in Bogota, a rapid transit bus system on the surface with dedicated lanes so that buses can run quickly and not slowly has allowed Bogota to cut its car emissions, because even the middle class now takes the buses because they're faster than cars. In other words, cities one by one have many solutions. We all know about the bicycles that are everywhere here in Barcelona and all over the world now that allow ordinary people to ride bicycles, and the dedicated bike lanes develop. We know the pedestrian zones, the congestion fees, and those are great changes. But when cities work together, they can have an impact on the most important index there is, carbon emissions, sending greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, because that's the source of the problem that will destroy us if we don't do anything about it. And what's extraordinary is that nation states will give you 10 different reasons why we should do something about it, but they can't. And cities will explain all that can be done and show you how they together can do it. And that is a fundamental difference. And that is why I argue that if we can find a way that mayors and city councilors and their citizens who they represent can meet together regularly to look at global problems, share common practices, do something that already is happening here in Barcelona with Cisco Systems in Barcelona, have this new city protocol that on the web allows cities already to share best practices, even in the absence of global governance institutions. If we could do this on a global scale so that cities and mayors, city councilors could cooperate systematically on dealing with some of the global cross-border problems I talked about, we would find we had an informal, soft form of global governance, not making laws, not telling people what to do, but because 52% of the world's population live in cities and 80% of the Western and developed world's population live in cities, and because 80% of GDP of the world comes from cities, cities are in a position to make the difference. You are trying to design from the bottom up small but powerful changes in how we house ourselves, how we transport ourselves, how we design our open spaces. But you need, from the top down, institutional governance organizations that facilitate and make that possible. And what I am suggesting here is that were we to fashion together a governance of cities globally across territories, a way in which mayors could meet regularly, sometimes in person, but perhaps more often on a virtual platform, on a platform that allowed mayors to sit in their own office but talk to one another around the world, we would be in a position to begin to solve the problems that threaten not just our sustainability, but our very survival as a species. And that, in other words, it is time today, by going back to the old polis, the essential human community, that we might be able to move forward to the cosmopolis, the union of cities, the union of mayors that could solve all of the problems that government is supposed to solve, not the problems of God and philosophy and theater and performance and entrepreneurship, but the problems of the frame, the problems that allow everything else to happen. That's what government's supposed to do. Cities are proving they can do it, and if they work together, I think they will prove they can do it globally. Thank you.
So thank you, Ben. We can receive questions from Barber, from the audience. We have with us Manuel San Romat, that is the president of the City Protocol Society, that is an organization much more embedded on this. We have Joan Subirat, that is professor of sociology, so we'll be more than happy to receive comments and from you.
I think you got the word. I mean, it's cosmopolis. I mean, it's only the problem is only how we build it. And what do we do with nations? What's the role of nations? I mean, it's clear that cities are a great invention. They have worked. We had another great invention, which is in the internet. So we have the tools, we have the basis, we have the cells, we have the tools. But still, there are nations, and still there are passports, and still there are old ways of doing. In fact, always only 200 or 300 years old, because before that there were not one or two big states. But what do we do with nations, with nacioneta?
The nation state is not going away. Sovereignty is not going away. The power of the nation is not going away. But two important things. First of all, the nation state and the cities have the same citizens. In fact, 80% of the citizens of most Western countries are citizens of cities and the nation state, which means democracy is a powerful tool to force the state to recognize and help empower the city, if we use it that way. We still do our politics around 19th century ideas of socialism and capitalism and proletarians and so forth, and we don't think about the issues of city empowerment. If the 80% of people who lived in Europe in the cities said to their national governments, we want more jurisdiction, more authority, more resources for the cities would be much stronger. Sometimes it looks like cities are saying that Barcelona is saying to Madrid, please give us some more resources. Madrid doesn't have to give anything to Barcelona. Barcelona has to be permitted to keep the resources that it generates. Cities generate 80% of the wealth, 85% of the taxes. States take it, they use it for national defense, they use it for parks, good, fine, that's fine. But they make it very hard for cities to get much of it back. Cities pay out far more than they get back. They produce more wealth than they receive, and then they are asked to deal with these problems. So part of the job is not to do away with the state, but to insist by democratic means that the state return to cities the jurisdictional authority and the resources they need to solve these problems. And make no mistake, states are run by people who want these problems solved. And the smart national politicians understand that. In December, 15 new mayors, including de Blasio of New York and Garcetti of Los Angeles and many others, Walsh of Boston, went to Washington to meet with Obama. 30 years ago, it would have been for the mayors to say, please, Mr. President, help us. Solve our problems, give us money. Obama invited them to Washington and said, please, Mr. Mayors, help me solve my problems. Help me do things because the federal government is paralyzed and we can't do things. In the United States, the federal government is looking for help from the cities. So increasingly, I think cities will be invited to help solve the problems that national states cannot solve. But cities have to demand what is their right. The right to a fair part of the resources they produce, a right to jurisdiction over the areas they serve, not the old city walls from the Middle Ages, but the new mega-regional jurisdiction of the modern city. And that is how it will go. The state will not go away, but another way to put it is that Jean Monnet had a great solution to the problem of ineffective national sovereignty. He said, let's pool sovereignty and create a pooled Europe. Well, that was one solution. My suggestion is shared sovereignty, that power has to be devolved not at the discretion of the nation state, but it has to be genuinely shared, which means cities need a piece of sovereignty. They shouldn't have to go on bended knee and request resources. They should have a right to the resources and the jurisdiction that make governance possible. And because the citizens are the same citizens of the state and the city, I think with time that is possible. But part of the importance of a global parliament is to put a megaphone in front of the voice of cities. Because right now, cities speak one by one. They speak in old institutions. This is the global parliament of mayors. You put this in front of their voices, and you hear the voice of mayors. You can hear how they speak. And cities need a megaphone. They need a microphone. They need an amplifier. They need to be heard. And they need to be heard when they speak together, because their voices are loud, their citizens are a majority, and they produce the wealth of the world. So they can be heard if they are willing to speak louder.
Joan.
Well, I enjoy very much your speech. If we see what happened here in Spain or in Europe, we see that there is a trend to re-centralize power to the state in order to fight the economic crisis. In a sense, for example, that's the case of our Ley Montoro here in Spain. No? In that sense, what do you think? What kind of incentives they have the cities to cooperate between them? I mean, what's the element? Because we could consider that the incentive is to compete between each other. What are the incentives to cooperate? What do you think about that?
The incentive to cooperate is simple. It's survival. It's sustainability. Cities cannot do it alone. There's no way in a world, that's where I started. In a world of global warming, global health problems, global trade, global markets, global labor forces, global capital, no city, and for that matter, no state, can survive one by one. You work together or you don't survive. So the incentive is selfish. A city says, a mayor says, I work with other mayors. My job is to serve my people, but I cannot serve my people unless I work with other mayors, unless I work with other cities. Barcelona cannot be a great city on the Mediterranean unless it works with Marseille, unless it works with the cities on the North Sea, unless it works with Hong Kong and Singapore and Houston and Los Angeles and other ports around the world. It cannot deal with the problems of immigration it faces unless it works with Casablanca, unless it works with Marseille, unless it works with the other cities where the migrants move looking for jobs. We do it together or we don't do it, and that is a powerful, powerful incentive for smart mayors. There's some who are not so smart. That's always the case. The great obstacle, as we know, to change in human progress is very simple. It's stupidity, and it's there. But what's interesting is that I have met in the last couple of years very many smart, prudent mayors. And they will say to me, they don't say, why should I cooperate? They will say to me, I know if I don't cooperate, I'm finished. My city is finished. We need each other. We need to do it together. And the other part of the question is what I said before. Nation states play a zero-sum game. One is the most powerful nation, the other is less powerful. Cities have never played a zero-sum game. They grow and flourish together. Barcelona can have a great opera house, and so can Paris, and so can Rome. It's not that if Barcelona has a great opera house, Madrid must have a poor one. That Bilbao can have a great museum, and therefore Barcelona can't have any good museums. You know, it doesn't. Cities don't compete that way in a zero-sum game. In fact, like cities with good restaurants, the more the better. You know, in the city, when we come here, each time my wife and I come, remarkable how the food, how wonderful it is. And then we go to a new restaurant, and you might say, there's no room for a new restaurant. There's so many good old ones already. But of course, restaurants can grow together, so can cities. So cities don't compete the same way nations do. They need each other to survive. So I am convinced that they can and will work together.
Estoy haciendo yo de manager.
Thank you. My question relates to a previous work from you regarding the well-known Jihad versus McWorld. So where we are in that sense, and especially we think about three pillars, so to say, in any society. One, where the society is ruled by hierarchy, so you have one ruler, like the nation state in the old days. The other one where the marketplace rules, seems to nowadays, so to say. And the third pillar will be like a society built on altruism. So for instance, trying to help the curbing of the carbon emissions seems a good proposition. So how do you see society nowadays in that tug of war between these three pillars, and how it affects cities, obviously?
That's a very good question, and in the next 2 hours I'll try to answer it, because it raises a great many problems that obviously we can't talk about in full. One problem it raises is the problem that I take up in Jihad versus McWorld, the problem of global capitalism and global pop culture and that effect. And one of the problems cities face is that they constantly deal with the consequences of forces they don't control. The inequality of cities, the ghettos of cities, the refugees who come from the war zones to cities are produced by forces that cities have nothing to do with. It's nation states and tribes and religions and other things that produce those problems, but cities have to do with it. Global capitalism has many strengths, but it has many weaknesses. It produces goods and commodities and wealth and prosperity, but it also produces inequality. It often destroys jobs. It produces injustice. Cities have to deal with the inequality and the injustice, and they have to find ways to do it, and that's, you might say, that's unfair. But mayors will tell you, I know it's unfair, but that's my job. You know, I can't change the fact that capital is global, And I have to deal with inequality in the local form and find ways to deal with it, but they do it. But that's also why I say we need global governance institutions as global as the problems we face. If global capitalism creates problems, then we need global governance to respond to global capitalism. If problems of disease are global, we need global governance to deal with it. So global governance through cities is a way of responding to these problems. But the last thing I want to say about that book, Jihad versus McWorld, was a very, very popular book. It basically argued that our democracy was being crushed between the forces of aggressive commercial consumer capitalism and the reactionary tribal and religious forces that were trying to destroy capitalism, modernity, and with it democracy. And either way, whoever won, democracy lost. That was the argument. And one of the things that has been heartening to me is that this new book has been taken to be a very optimistic book, and it is, because it says democracy can work in the city and in any city, inner city governments. Citizenship can still be engaged in the city. We live in a world where young people have given up on democracy, where in the Arab Spring we've already gone to an Arab winter without ever having democracy, where people in the emerging world think democracy doesn't work, and people in our world think it's finished. Young people particularly who don't vote and who turn their backs on the public side and just go to make money for themselves because they think it's over. This book, I think, this notion of cities inspires hope again. It inspires promise. It promises young people that if they engage themselves as the citizens of cities, they can make a difference. That as cities cooperate, they can solve problems. And in a world of cynicism about democracy and pessimism about the future, I think the hope that the city brings and the life of the cities bring is one of its greatest virtues in taking on the problems of the 21st century.
Well, thanks a lot, Mr. Barber. Thanks also for the reference to the IaaC in your book. And we have an enormous complicity with your approach, as you can imagine, more dynamic, flexible, and more empathic also. And I was thinking in this history about the guy of the Bruxelles, the responsible of the commission, and this idea of the cities were a kind of level of governance. Hey, no, it's not possible. No. This idea, evidently for him and for a lot of people, we have this lineal and deterministic vision that the cities are included in regions, the regions are included in scales and as a kind of matryoshkas, no? In states, the states are in and this is the lineal and deterministic vision of but evidently in your vision where the cities are in a new scale of relations, no? Rapport, no? Of more or less connecting with the question before, well, we have this idea, but if we think about supra-urban structures, evidently for you, these supra-urban structures are relations between cities, intercities, but we can, this is my question, we can think in a new kind of paradigms where the cities are not included in different levels, but more they are multi-belonging. Again, they are multi-belonging in different networks that are dynamic and flexible, as a kind of dynamic contracts. The contract seems very, very very pragmatic, but different contract or relations or links of associations where the cities are in new kind of supra-urban structures, because perhaps we need this, evidently, but at the same time these supra-structures are not fixed in a kind of fixed structures, but more in a different contracts of multi-relational and multi-regional things. This is more or less the vision, or for this, or it's not necessary absolutely this new kind of systems collective systems between cities. This is my question, more or less is in relation with this idea that what about the nations? Evidently for me it's very clear but this idea that we are in a new period of networks, that the guys, the individual, the persons can be not subjects in one structures but in different structures, perhaps is the same for the cities, but I don't know.
I love questions which provide their own answers, and that's a great question because you did give I like it because you gave exactly the right answer, which is that the great strength of cities is that they are dynamic, not fixed, that they're in what some city theorists talk about as flows, networks. Manuel Castells talks about a series of networks in which our identities move around, in which our patriotism, our belonging is a multi-belonging, as you put it, belonging to different levels. It's perfectly possible to say, I'm from this neighborhood and I'm from the city of Barcelona, I'm Catalonian, but I'm Spaniard, and I'm European, but I'm a global cosmopolitan, and all of those things are true. You don't say to that person, no, you're confused, make up your mind, who are you? You say, no, that's who you are, because our identity today is complex and it plays at different levels. The problem with the state and with Europe is that they have a hierarchy of identity. And they say you're a European first, you're a regional person second, you're a Frenchman third, you're in the province or the Land or the canton fourth, and then you're in the metro region, and then you're in the city, and then you're in the neighborhood. And the relationship is called subsidiarity, which means at the lower level you say, yes sir, to the higher level. And Europe has failed for me in part, and I fear the elections next month will represent a reaction against Europe, because Europe has insisted on bureaucracy, subsidiarity, immobility, fixity in those relations, and has not allowed that fluidity of relations. People who work on the web, people who work in the new digital technology, understand the fluidity of those relations. You go on the web and you can be 10 different things in 5 minutes. You can be in many different places. You can assume many different identities. It allows us the very flexibility and mobility that brings people to the city. People love the web for the same reason they love the city. And one of the reasons I think the web can work very well with the city is that it has the same flexibility, the same dynamism, and so forth. So I think you're completely right to say that when we think of the city, we think of its dynamism, its creativity, and particularly, I didn't mention it, but it's essential, the role of imagination. Because the city is rooted in the force of imagination. The right to imagine yourself something different. It's so interesting that people who want to imagine themselves as a little different, maybe a different gender, maybe a different religion, maybe a different profession, they come to the city where the possibility of imagination allows you to invent yourself and reinvent yourself and invent the relations in different ways that you have. The governor of New Jersey, who lived in New Jersey a number of years ago, declared that he was gay. And he had to resign the governorship because back then it was felt that that was impossible. Where did he move? He left New Jersey and he moved into New York City. And there he could be gay and reestablish himself as a humanitarian professional, working beautifully, and as an advisor to New Jersey politicians, which he still does. But in New York City, he was able to reclaim a different identity, to accept the mobility and the fluidity of our nature. So I think cities are brilliant at that. And that's why, for me, the city needs to be the first place we discover, because it's there that mobility and multi-belonging is possible, whereas the state says something else. The state says you are French, you are Japanese, you're an American, you must die to be an American. Whereas the city says if you come to the city, you can be many things, including a citizen of our city. So I think that your point is very powerful and very real.
So thanks very much, Professor Barber, for your lecture, for sharing with us your brilliant reflection and your inspiring ideas, but also for the enthusiasm and the energy that you put on the lecture. That is something always very helping in order to find creative solution to the problem. So I think it has been a very special night. Thanks to all of you and to Professor Barber.